So this is the fourth and I think final video in this kind of series that I've done here on time and calendars and God resting and the Sabbath and all that. This series has really proven the Adventist doctrine of an eternal, unbroken 7-day cycle is false. I started this whole series off here just showing just the nation of Israel and the Pharisees versus the Essene Jews of the Qumran area and what those two groups did to their calendars. We see that the Pharisees of the time of Jesus at will changed their calendar. They would add days if they didn't see the new moon. You can't add a day to the calendar and not change the existing 7-day cycle because you're adding a day. Remember what I said. If you add or subtract from the calendar and you're not doing it in increments of 7, you will change the weekly cycle. So yes, Friday is still followed by Saturday, but it's not the original Friday, it's not the original Saturday, etc., because you added a day. Adventists have a hard time getting that. We saw in the 1582 calendar change, 11 days were subtracted from the year. That year got 11 days shorter. To achieve that 11-day shortness, 2 Sabbaths were eliminated. And if you look at the 1582 calendar, start in January and then look in October. October 15th is supposed to be a Monday. But they took 11 days out of the calendar and, well, that October 15th is no longer a Monday. It turned into a Friday. That too is a change to this so-called eternal 7-day cycle. Now then, we also showed the Adventist God is, well, a Sabbath resting God who observes the Sabbath. Adventists love to teach. Mark 2:27. The Sabbath was made for man. The Adventist God observed the Sabbath, therefore the Adventist God is a man. Meaning anyone who observes the Sabbath is a man. But we saw in Adventist literature, their God is a Sabbath keeper. Well, they just made their God no more than a man. So the Adventist God teaches that God rests in Genesis 2:2. All I want to say is kind of this rhetorical question, which I'm going to answer, is does the Bible teach rest in Genesis 2:2? Rest. I'm now going to examine that word often translated, the Hebrew that is, for rest, in Genesis 2:2 and prove it does not mean what Adventists teach. God did not rest or observe a Sabbath or observe a resting Sabbath as an example for mankind as taught in Adventist literature. The Hebrew word for Sabbath, by the way, does not appear in Genesis 2:2 or the entire book of Genesis. I'm going to make that point a couple times. But in the Adventist teaching, God is a Sabbath keeper who established the Sabbath in Genesis 2:2, even though the word is not even present. For Adventists to teach a God who's keeping the Sabbath in Genesis 2:2 is to mean, well, the Sabbath existed in Genesis 2:2. And we're going to see it absolutely does not. And Adventism teaches, said this many times, you've seen in previous videos, their God observed the Sabbath in Genesis 2:2, and a Sabbath that does not exist because the Hebrew word doesn't exist. Look with me here in their literature. Here's 5 citations of God keeping the Sabbath or embracing a whole day of rest and making it his own day, setting a precedent, an example. You don't set an example unless you do it, and that means God is, well, keeping the Sabbath that we see here in 1971. And the last one in the lower right hand corner, God himself set the example of Sabbath keeping. All that does is make the Seventh-day Adventist God. He's just a resting Sabbath keeper. As you can see here, a little sleepy, snoozy Seventh-day Adventist God. A God who observed a Sabbath as a result of Genesis 2:2 is just a false God. Adventism has a false God. They got a false Christ, they got a false God, they got a false gospel, they got lots of falseness in Seventh-day Adventism. So the Hebrew word for Sabbath, it's a legal term. I mean, do I really even have to say this to you, Adventists? It's a legal term, and a legal term that when it's used has to come with all kinds of rules, commands, etc. for it. But we don't see that in the entire book of Genesis. So the absence of the Sabbath in Genesis is more than just the absence of a word. It's the absence of all that required legal explanation that goes along with it. It's just not there. We're going to look at a few books. We're going to start here looking at this. This is called the Englishman's Concordance. This is a concordance of the Hebrew Bible, and it'll show us every place any given word is mentioned. From there, we're going to go to this one next. This is a 17-volume Old Testament dictionary, and we are going to look at, what volume do I have here? Volume 14. We're going to actually look at the word rest, and we're also going to look at the word rest here in an older lexicon, Adventist approved, and you'll see that. It's a Driver and Briggs lexicon. So we're going to look at those three books. So let's start here with the Englishman's Concordance, same book I just held up there. So for reference, you can see the title page and the copyright. Here's page 1235. Here is every occurrence of the word Sabbath. I'm going to blow it up now on this page. And look at the first occurrence of the word Sabbath. Exodus 16:23. Not Genesis, Exodus. That means the first 65 chapters of the Bible. Genesis has 50, and we go to Exodus 1 to 15. 65 chapters of the Bible. The very first ones do not even have the word Sabbath showing. So now I've come to learn that Adventists largely rely on the King James translation of the Bible, and then when they see the word rest, they totally rely on that. Remember what I say in my videos: you should only use the King James when you're having discussions with people who are 400 years old and older, because the Adventists see the word rest and they translate it in their mind. We've already seen it in their literature in a very literal English sense, not a Hebrew sense, but an English sense. We get this, the classic definition of rest: to cause someone or something to, well, stop doing a particular activity or stop being active for a period of time in order to relax, get back your strength. In other words, rest means, well, what we all think it means is rest. Here is the King James Version, which Adventists rely on. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day. We are now going to look at that Hebrew word, often translated, not universally though, as rested for Genesis 2:2. And we're going to look at the word for Sabbath. And we're going to have a little bit of some good key learning and distinctions between these two terms. Rest and Sabbath are two completely different Hebrew words. I'm going to look at, and I'm going to show you Genesis 2:2, which is it's used, translated as rest in the King James, and the very first occurrence of the word for Sabbath. Remember, Exodus 16:23. Let's look right here. Here's Genesis 2:2. Here is Exodus 16:23. Here is the word rested, and here's the word Sabbath. Look at the Hebrew. Look at the transliteration. What do you think? Is it the same word? Is it a different word? The Hebrew letters, they look identical, don't they? And the transliteration, well, it's the same English letters, right? If you're not paying attention to the details, and you need to really pay attention to the details here and the transliteration, you're gonna draw wrong conclusions. So let me explain to you why, and we're going to do a little lesson on what's called diacritical marks. Look with me here and read with me the red text in the lower right hand corner. Vowels absent in the original consonantal text were later added as diacritical marks by the Masorite scholars in, you can see, 7th to 10th century. Right above that red text is this Wikipedia here, and it's showing as dotted circles Hebrew type letters, and that's what it's trying to portray. But then look at all the little dotting diacritical marks underneath it. These are what distinguish the Hebrew letters and characters, and this is what makes Hebrew words unique, these diacritical marks. Look again at our example in Genesis 2:2 and Exodus 16:23. Now pay attention. Look at those diacritical marks. They are completely different. Yeah, the Hebrew letters are the same. That's called the root word, by the way. But what makes the words different are the pronunciations, which you can only learn by looking at the diacritical marks. And you see different diacritical marks in the Hebrew and for the transliterated English. This is a topic I am very familiar with Islam. Here is a picture of a Quran in what's called the Kufic script. Look, it has no dots, dashes, etc. The original Quran was written in the Kufic script. And about the 7th century, isn't that interesting? Because that's about the time that we see here in Hebrew, they were doing exactly the same thing. Diacritical marks were added. By the way, let me just deviate here from you. If you're doing any Christian apologetics to Muslims, and Muslims love to say the Quran we have today is the Quran given to Muhammad. It's not, because it was originally written in Kufic script. And Muslims today, and I've showed them that. I have a book over here of from the Chester Beatty Library in Manchester, England. Has some very early Quranic manuscripts in Kufic, and I have taken those with me on the street. I've shown them to Muslims, and I said, read it. And they look at it and they say, I can't. That's right, because it doesn't have the diacritical marks, so they don't know how to pronounce the words. And that's what we see here, what happened in Hebrew. They added the diacritical marks because Hebrew and their teachings were oral, just like Islam. And when they said, we got it, we're moving from the oral to books and scrolls, they needed to know how to pronounce it, and they developed the diacritical marks, just like Islam did. All right, let's go back here to our slide. So you look at these words now. Now you can see these words are completely different words. You can see the placement of the diacritical marks on each one. Now, the Sabbath law and this legal term did not exist. There is no biblical record prior to Exodus 16:23 of anyone being commanded to observe the Sabbath or anyone observing the Sabbath. So think again, Adventists, if you want to say Genesis 2:2 is God arresting and creating the Sabbath, you can't create it if the word doesn't even exist, and it doesn't exist. Adventists in their literature, as we just saw, they attribute a resting, a Sabbath rest, to their God, and that is a biblical inaccuracy. So does the word rendered rest have a relationship to the Sabbath? We're now going to, well, let's look at that. Let's look at what does the word rest mean? How does it or does it relate to a Sabbath? Remember, we're going to look in this book here. We're going to look at volume 14. I'm going to show you that on screen. But before we do, you are going to see in that explanation here some Hebrew verb tenses. You're going to see these words in these red boxes here are going to be in the text we're going to read. So when you see those words, know we're just talking about, it's the same word, but just different tenses of that word. So here's the very book I held up, and you can see the title page and the copyright should you wish to check it out, and I encourage you to do so. But I want you to know, first of all, this whole series here ultimately was copyrighted in 2004. So pretty quickly after it was copyrighted, Adventists start using it. So if you guys can use it, Adventism, so can I. So let's go to page 381, and here's the word translated as, well, rest. And look at the basic meaning is what? Cease, come to an end, and then they're going to talk about a specialized meaning of celebrate, and that's a meaning that came later. So let's just kind of look at this definition here, the etymology. So the verb Shabbat, which maintains the same basic meaning of what? Cease, come to an end, and in the qual, and you can see there's those three tenses for Hebrew. In these three tenses of Hebrew, it developed a specialized meaning of celebrate. There you go. I mean, we could just end it right here. The word means cease, come to an end, later a specialized meaning of celebrate. Now what the text that follows this is a controversy. And you can see the very bottom here, I'll just read this to you. It says it demonstrates its dependence on the specialized meaning that developed in Hebrew in connection with the seventh day. There are some scholars who believe that this word here, we're looking at Shabbat, often translated as rest, was a derivative from the Hebrew word for Sabbath. But then there's others who think, no, the Hebrew word for Sabbath comes from this word right here. So there's a controversy on that, and that's what the rest of this text is actually saying. The author of this book is actually making the point. His belief is the word Sabbath comes from this word here, not the other way around. So let's continue here, and let's look here at the next. Here, the basic meaning of this word is what? Cease, come to an end. And in this Hebrew tense, they say this occurs 27 times. But then they say, as we're counting them, we are ignoring for a moment those passages in which this verb, is used in connection with the commandment to observe a day of rest and the institution of the Sabbath. And then when it says, when you ignore those, and just look at this word by itself, a picture is going to emerge. So let me give you an example of one of those that the author was talking about ignoring. That would be this one right here. So when this word to cease activity is used in relation to the Sabbath, as you can see here, those are part of the 27 this author did not count. Then he goes on to say in the basic meaning, and about what's going to be revealed. Then he says, for example, after ending the flood, God decrees that seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter day and night harvest shall cease. Doesn't say rest, says cease. So let's look at that. Here it is, Genesis 8:22, shall cease. There it is, Shabbat, which is just a cessation, a stopping of activity. Then he goes on to say here, and this is a very interesting one now. So when this verb, Shabbat, is translated, and it is 3 times as Sabbath in our Bible, it's a Sabbath for the land. It's never translated as Sabbath and related to people. So look here at the underlined text at the top. However, not only the people, but the land enjoyed a rest every 7 years. Leviticus 25:2, 26:34, and 2 Chronicles 36:21. Here it is right here. Here's 2 Chronicles 36:21, and the other 2 citations in Leviticus. And the other 2 citations in Leviticus are in some translations translated as rest and some as Sabbath, but in a lot of times they're Sabbath. So when this word is translated as a Sabbath, it's a Sabbath for the land. It's nowhere used as a Sabbath for people. Let's do a summary here, and we're going to read this paragraph. It's a very important paragraph. And this is an overview. Shows that the basic meaning of this verb, rest, Shabbat, in the first Hebrew tense means what? Cease, come to an end. In the next Hebrew tense, it means be brought to an end, disappear. And in the last Hebrew tense, bring to an end, eliminate. Nowhere here do we get rest. Let's continue reading. This reference is consistently to the cessation of some previous activity. And then he goes on to say, even in those passages, remember we looked at one of them, in which this verb in its tense refers to or is being used with the institution of the Sabbath, the basic meaning of cease or come to an end, it's still unmistakable. That's what the word means, cease, come to an end. The reference is to that behavior which constitutes the observance of the Sabbath itself, or in the manner of the Sabbath observance, to the conclusion of the specific process. He ends it here. In no instance does this word, Shabbat, as such mean rest from work. And no evidence suggests that Shabbat itself, in other words, he's saying that this word didn't come from the Hebrew word for Sabbath, which is what we see here on the very last word of the sentence, but it's the other way around. The Sabbath came from this word. So remember what I said, that's a point of controversy. Nonetheless, what you just read here just refuted everything you see here on the slide in front of you in terms of Seventh-day Adventism. Seventh-day Adventist God kept the Sabbath, made it his own day, did it as an example, observed this for one whole day of rest. It doesn't mean rest. It means stopping work. Let's just look. Brown, Driver, and Briggs, I held up earlier. This comes from a 1906 edition. It's Adventist proof. Adventists start quoting this in 1938. I got 17 citations. So here is the actual word for Shabbat on page 991, and it has 3 meanings. Look at them. Cease, desist, and rest. Look at meaning number 1, cease. Look at meaning number 2, desist. Meaning number 3 is rest, and that's land, that's sea, that you see at the very bottom. But look at meaning number 2, desist. And we see here, desist is Genesis 2:2. God did not rest from his labor, he ceased working in his labor. So in conclusion, the Hebrew word for Sabbath is missing in the first 65 chapters of the Bible. So the rest of Genesis 2:2 is not related to the Sabbath. It really says, I quit working. The correct usage and understanding of this word is, as we've seen now in these 2 sources and others I could show you, is just simply cease or desist labor. Which another way to say Genesis 2:2, God ceased his creative work. That's the proper understanding of Genesis 2:2. God did not rest, God ceased his creative work. One Bible translation I have does a fantastic job at accurately translating this verse. Look with me here, and this is the very cover of the Bible that I have, the International Standard Version. By the seventh day, God had completed the work he had done, so on the seventh day, he stopped working on everything he had done. Beautiful translation. Fits right along with the correct understanding and usage of the Hebrew word that we just saw. So God did not rest. God did not keep a Sabbath, as Adventism teaches. God did not keep a Sabbath as an example for man. The Hebrew word Shabbat, to deceased, does not mean to show an example of rest. Adventism says, well, God showed an example of rest for us. No, that means in order to do that, your God has to keep the Sabbath. But as we saw, that whole definition doesn't exist in this for this Hebrew word. So the God of Adventism is a resting, Sabbath-keeping God, well, as they told us in their own literature. So based on the evidence from their own literature, you Adventists are worshiping a false God. Your God has to show you by example how to keep a Sabbath. Your God either keeps a Sabbath, etc. Adventism, not only do you have a false Jesus, but you have a false Sabbath-keeping example God. You have your idea of Genesis 2:2 completely wrong. Adventism has taught you wrong. Now that you know the truth, you should get out of this false religion.